This is the lesson for Chapter 9, Section 3, titled Solving Quadratic Equations. And so we're going to take a look at a quadratic equation is one in which we have the squared symbol for one of the variables. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to isolate that variable term. So if I divide by 4 on both sides, I've got a squared equals 9. And so when I go ahead and take the square root, I could find out what the value of a is, because I see that two numbers that multiply to make 9 would be 3 and 3. But since there could be possibly two answers, we need to show that by saying plus or minus 3, because negative 3 times negative 3 equals 9, and positive 3 times by the positive 3 also equals 9. So the answers are plus or minus 9. And so let's take a look at the next problem here. Now the directions here, it does say solve by graphing, but we're going to solve by using square roots. We're going to use square roots. We graphed in previous sections, and so this is what we're going to end up doing. So we go ahead and subtract the 28 from both sides, and I could go ahead and divide by the 7, because that's what I want to do, isolate the variable term. But once I get the isolated variable term, notice how you've got, and we can actually do that division here, we've got negative 4. See, if we took the square root, we would try to find two numbers that multiply by each other to make a negative, and we can't do that. And so here we say there is no real solution. Later on, we're going to use that phrase there, no real solution, because there are solutions, but they're not real number solutions. And so for right now, that's the phrase we're going to use. There's no real solution, real number solution. So on this one, well, we have to add the 54 to both sides. And so I've got 6n squared equals 54. When I divide by 6, I end up getting n squared equals 9. That's positive 9. I could take the square root. Hey, and I did that earlier, and I know that the answer is plus or minus 3. So for this one, when I divide by 0 or 7, I get 0. And on this one, this is the only number in which we have just one solution, because there is no positive 0, there is no negative 0, there's just 0. And this one is 0 because we're dividing a number into 0, and that does go in there 0 times. Where on this one, I have to add the 2 to both sides, and I have this fraction. Well, to get rid of a fraction, all we're going to do is multiply by its reciprocal, and that will cancel out the denominator. And so I've got x squared equals 4. So when I go ahead and take the square root of both sides, I'm left with those two numbers, plus or minus 2. Where on this one, well, I have to subtract the 49, and everything looks good except, hey, I've got that negative sign again inside, or that's x squared is equal to, and we can't take the square root of a negative number and get real solutions. And so we're going to say there are no real number solutions. And so that's what we'll end up saying for that answer there. Well, let's move on to the next type of problem that we'll end up seeing. And we got some word problems. It says model each problem with a quadratic equation and solve, if necessary, round to the nearest tenth. And so we're trying to find the side length of a square. Well, a square has each side being the same. We know that the area is 196, so x squared equals 196. That's the equation. This is model each problem with a quadratic equation. We did that. Now we're going to solve. So when we take the square root, remember, two numbers that multiply to make 196. This is an even number. It's even, and it ends in a 6. So the best numbers, we have two different options. It could either end in a 4 or end in a 6. And I'm going to try 14, and that's the number that ends up working. Just put some units with this problem, since we do have units in the problem initially. So here we have to find the radius of a circle whose area is 100 inches squared. So remember, area formula goes this way, pi r squared. So what we're going to be doing is dividing by pi, and then we've got a over pi equals r squared. So when I go ahead and substitute the numbers in there, I've got 100 over pi equals r squared. So I've got to take the square root. Now I got to take the square root of this quotient. So I'm going to end up entering into the calculator 100 divided by 3.14. Now when you do this, leave that number as I'll write all those decimals down. In my calculator, it leaves it in the fraction form. It's 5,000 over 157. Now I just used 3.14 for pi, rather than using the pi button, but it's going to be about the same answer anyhow. So I still need to take the square root, so I'm going to take the square root of that entire number. Again, don't round that number. Keep that whole number in there, and then take the square root of that. And so I'll take the square root of that number, and so let me write it in there real quick. And that gives me 5.64. So I'm going to write in there 5.64, and then I've got these 3's at the end. Now, if you use the pi button, it would give you about the same answer. And so it says to round to the nearest tenth. And so here's the tenths place. The 4 is not big enough to round that up. So I'm just going to leave it as 5.6, and I'm in inches there. And that's what the radius is. So it says find the side length of the square whose area is 50. Okay, so area equals, and then it's a square, so it's just side length x squared. And so 50 equals x squared. Well, when you take the square root of 50, it's not a perfect square. And so do that work, and it says that it is 7.07, and then the numbers continue to go on. And so I'm rounding to the tenths place, so the 7 rounds that up to 7.1 centimeters. Well, a little bit more complicated problem because the more words in the problem. So it says the square tarp, but it's pretty much the same type, because notice it says the square tarp you were raking leaves onto has an area of 140 feet squared. What is the side length of the tarp? It's the same problem as these 22 and 24. The only difference is we have more words. And you see how they have the directions in the problem rather than a set of directions before. So we're still supposed to round to the nearest foot if necessary. So same sort of thing, area equals x squared. Since it's a square tarp, side length squared. So 150 equals x squared. When I take the square root of both sides, all I have to do is find the square root of 150. Now I know the answer is going to be between 12 and 13, because the square root of 12 is 144. The square root of, the square root that makes 12 is 144. The square root that makes 13 is 169. It's between the two numbers, so I know it's going to end up being between those two values, and let's see, our answer is 12.24. So 12.24. So the 4 is not big enough to round that up, so we're going to say it's about 12.2, and let's see, our units are feet. Well, here it says there is enough mulch to spread over a flower bed with an area of 85 meters squared. What is the radius of the largest circular flower bed that can be covered by the mulch? So it's the same problem as number 23, just more words. And so we've got the same situation. Area equals pi r squared. Again, I'm going to solve for r, so I'm dividing by pi, and I've got area over pi equals r squared. So again, I'm just taking the square root, but I'm taking the square root of both numbers. And so I can actually plug this entire thing into my calculator. I can plug in the square root, and then I'm going to plug in 85 and pi. And you could use 3.14 or the pi button. It's going to give you about the same answer. And so 85 divided by, and I'm going to use the pi button this time. And when I plug that in the calculator, this is what I got, 5.20. And so the 0 is not big enough to round that up. We're rounding the nearest tenth again, so we're going to say it's about 5.2 meters. Oops, let's rewrite that. So r equals 5.2 meters. So let's take a look at the last few problems here. Here it says find the value of x. It's a little bit more complicated. So we've got the area right here. So remember, our formula goes this way. And so it's just side length squared. So side length is 2x, but I've got to square both the 2 and the x. Area is 34. Oops, not 24, but 34. And so when I do this, when I square this, I've got 4x squared equals 34. So I go ahead and divide by 4, and I've got this. I can go ahead and reduce this a little bit. So this is going to end up being 17 over 2. And then I can go ahead and take the square root. And so not a perfect square, so we're supposed to, again, round to the nearest tenth where necessary. So I'll go ahead and plug into my calculator the square root of, and then I got 17 over 2. And when I do that, I get this answer here. So about 2.91, and then it goes on. And so rounding to the nearest tenth does not round that up, rounds it down. 2.9, and then inches is the value of x. Where over here, I see it's an isosceles triangle, so my formula is 1/2 base times height. Well, base and height are the same. And so since they're the same, I could just write 3x quantity squared times by 1/2 equals, and then 95. So the first step I'm going to do is get rid of that fraction, multiply by 2, and I'm left with 190 equals, and then I'll square this. I get 9x squared. I got the 9 because 3 times 3 is 9. Well, look, when I divide, I got to divide by 9. So now I've got this. 190 over 9 equals x squared. So I'm just going to take the square root, but make sure, again, you do the division first, then take the square root. And don't round anything until the end of the answer. So I'm going to plug into the calculator 190 divided by 9, and then I have to take the square root of that, and this is the answer I end up getting for x. So I got 4.59, and then it goes on. And I don't need any other numbers except these to be able to round to the tenths place. So there's the tenths, and 9 is big enough. So 4.6, and these are meters, is the value of x. So those are the problems you're going to see on tonight's homework. Good luck.